Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever RSPO North America Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue. My name is Cameron Plesh, and I am the U.S. representative for the RSPO. While we wait a few minutes for all of the other attendees to join us, please take a moment to answer the poll question that you see on your screen, and we'll share those results shortly before we begin. We'll be beginning the broadcast in about 1 minute. Thank you to those of you that just joined us. Again, we will be beginning shortly. While we wait for everybody else to join, please answer the poll question, and we will be sharing the results shortly, and we will be getting started very soon here. All right, hello everyone, and welcome again to the first ever North America Sustainable Palm Oil Dialogue brought to you by the RSPO. And thank you for joining this opening session. My name is Cameron Plesh, and I am the U.S. representative for the RSPO. Thank you everybody for answering our poll question. You can see the results here, which is really great to see. This is going to help set the tone for the rest of our panel and for everything our group of panelists will be discussing here today. Over the next 3 days, we'll be having a series of webinar sessions covering a wide range of important topics with a focus on how North American stakeholders can make an impact. If you have not yet registered for any of the other panels, you can register for each panel at rspo.org under the events section. I am honored and excited to introduce this session on the North American market 2020 and the way forward. Before we begin today's session, a bit of housekeeping though for everybody. All attendees are in listen-only mode, with only the panelist and moderator being visible and audible. However, we still really want to hear from all of you as well. So throughout the session, please type questions into the questions box that you can see in the right side of your screen on the menu bar. We'll ask as many questions as we can during the Q&A session, which will take place following the panel discussions. During the time when you're writing your questions, please do let us know if your question is directed towards any of the individuals on the panel or if it's directed to everybody in general. And although this conference was supposed to be in person as originally planned, for obvious reasons, we're all joining one another from around the world. So please bear with us if there are any technical challenges during this. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the session. Today moderating will be Aimee Rusillo, who is an expert on social and environmental standards and eco-labeling programs. She has over 25 years of experience in international sustainable development and extensively works with supply chain actors, NGOs, and governments to integrate sustainability into operations, strategic decision-making, and more effectively managing for impact under real-world conditions. She facilitates the UN-based International Technical Working Group on benchmarking and actively participates as an independent expert in several global benchmarking initiatives. Aimee, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Cameron. That was quite an intro. I'm going to try to live up to that with this panelist. We really have a terrific set of panelists lined up today, all seasoned veterans of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are really tackling a lot of the large issues together in these initiatives, including around forest and climate and agriculture. I'd like to do just a real quick round of the introductions, and I'm going to go from right to left as from our pictures below, which is usually we go left to right in our Western world, with Megan Weidner, and she's the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at Bunge North America. And she really brings a passion to her work, a passion about the environment, a passion about sustainability and about agriculture. She serves on a number of technical committees as well as multi-stakeholder initiatives, including in other commodity crops. She's based in St. Louis. We also have Mallorie Bruns, who's a senior mediator and program manager at the Meridian Institute. where they really focus on tackling those controversial and complex topics. She doesn't shy away from those. She works a lot on policies around tropical forest, and one of her keystone efforts over the last decade has been advancing the Tropical Forest Alliance. And Mallorie is based in Colorado. So we're kind of spanning a little bit more on the East Coast here. And David, last but not least, from National Wildlife Federation. He leads the Tropical Forest and Agriculture Project in Palm Oil. He's engaging in strategic conversations and international negotiations around climate change, focusing on land use, REDD, and agriculture. And David's based in DC. So as you can see, we've got quite a lineup here, and we intend to have quite an interesting conversation. As Cameron said, initially envisioned that both the title and this workshop was in person, and 2020, we were already kind of going, well, we haven't all met our targets for 2020, and so we really need to do some restocking. And of course, that was earlier in the year, and a lot of things have been totally upended since then. But we have recognized, even with the COVID-19, has really highlighted a lot of the critical issues around sustainability in our supply chains, and also even around inequalities. And so really now is even more important, it's now more vital that businesses, they can outline those future ambitions and resiliencies, why they're able to communicate a purpose that helps address the same challenges that we're facing. So we're really looking forward to a very insightful conversation now. I'd like to start out with really, though, first of all, thinking about where we are now. So a bit of taking stock. So we're in 2020. All of the panelists here, as you've heard, and many of you may know, they've been engaged in a lot of efforts in looking at working towards the 2020 targets. So I want to learn from them their own insights and their perspectives from their organizations and their unique experiences working across and within many of these multi-stakeholder initiatives. So first, I'd like to turn to you, Mallorie, if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about some of the lessons learned that you have in achieving these targets and setting the 2020 targets, and then that we can use for the going forward.
Thank you, and thank you to the RSPO for the invitation to be on this panel. My organization, Meridian Institute, is a nonprofit, and we specialize in collaborative problem solving. So we aren't a company that makes commitments, but we are involved in a number of multi-stakeholder initiatives that are active in the space. So for example, the Global Platform for the New York Declaration on Forests, the Tropical Forest Alliance, the Collaboration for Forest and Agriculture, and others. So from our experience working on these initiatives, I would like to share 3 quick lessons on what I think are a few factors contributing to some of the 2020 targets not being met. So first, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago when people who were working on these issues sort of collectively recognized that there was a problem and that there wasn't really a common understanding in what companies were being asked to commit to. And that realization led to the development of common norms and guidance for companies in the form of the accountability framework, which I think you will hear a bit more about later in the session. Second, we've learned that while progress has been made, when companies are making commitments, even at the CEO level, it can be a real challenge and a long-term process for companies to build awareness and buy-in for that commitment through the many layers of the business down to the operational side, especially when a company is working in multiple geographies. And third, I think the theory of change, that leading companies making commitments and taking action, that in that we would see a swell of other companies following suit, that hasn't necessarily been the case. To some extent it has, but I think because of marketplace dynamics that are competitive and the challenges that companies have in demonstrating their on-the-ground progress and linking that with how it's good for their business, those challenges have made it so that this almost spontaneous combustion of commitments leading to industry-wide transformation, that really just didn't happen as we had all hoped.
Great. So there's three important points that Mallory's raising. And maybe David, since she had mentioned the accountability framework, we could build upon that because I know you have a lot of experience with that.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I am on the steering group for that. Just a quick disclaimer, I've been advised that because I am generously supported by the Norwegian Forest and Climate Initiative, I do need to disclose that I'm registered under FARA with the Department of Justice. For those of you who don't know National Wildlife Federation, we are the largest conservation and education organization in the US with over 6 million members and supporters. So in the lead up to 2020, we've had over, I think, 450 individual no deforestation and human rights commitments. We have the New York Declaration on Forests, the CGF resolutions. All of this promise to usher in, a new era of responsible sourcing. Yet we saw deforestation continue to increase. So, a group of NGOs got together and said, why is this? Part of the reason is that there's a lack of shared definitions. So what constitutes forest? What constitutes deforestation? There's lots of terms out there, HCV, HCS. Understandably, folks were a bit confused. Relatedly, there's also then a lack of agreed upon metrics for how do we measure accountability to all of these commitments. I think there's confusion even amongst the major NGOs. So, there's mixed signals being sent. And as a result of a lot of missed opportunities, folks weren't communicating clearly upstream. We didn't know how to measure progress. So that was all the impetus to the Accountability Framework Initiative that Mallorie kindly mentioned. That initiative was formed in 2016, and it really provides a roadmap for how to establish, implement, and demonstrate progress on ethical supply chain commitments, regardless of the commodity or geography. We're in the process now of benchmarking the framework against other standards and initiatives like RSPO to see how these initiatives can fulfill the elements of the framework. We're also starting to partner with reporting platforms, like for those of you who are familiar with CDP and supply chain, to ensure greater consistency in how companies report and to ensure that we all have a shared understanding of the types of claims that can be made. I'm also hoping that we'll hear more about the AFI, how it's used by companies during tomorrow's session on deforestation.
Fantastic. We're already hearing some common threads around common language, whether it's definitions, metrics, and such. And how about you, Megan? I know that you involved in a number of initiatives, and so on setting the targets, what are some of the lessons learned that we can take from your experience? If you could speak up a little bit louder, your sound went down a little bit. Oh, better.
That probably helps if I have the microphone up here.
Much better, okay. Thanks.
So just a little background on Bunge. We sit right in the middle of the supply chain. So we're buying palm from refineries in Southeast Asia, moving it around the world and then processing it into ingredients for food customers around the world. And so from where we sit within the supply chain, I think the number one thing, and I've seen this theme in what Mallorie said and David as well, is collaboration. It's collaboration within the industry. There's no way that one person, one organization, or even one part of the supply chain can do this alone. And that goes across the whole supply chain. It has to include the plantations, the smallholders, the refineries, the mills, all the way to the consumer-facing brands and companies to work together to have a consistent goal and collaborate on some of the actions that are actually going to help us meet our goals. But I would say that by far that's the number one thing that I think that we have learned is reaching out for partnerships and understanding, because everybody's position in the supply chain, you have a very different perspective. And that perspective, of course, is going to change your approach. But to really be truly successful, because we're all here working on the same goals, we have to understand each other's perspectives.
Great. That's so we've got that collaboration, I think, and all of us working in these multi-stakeholder initiatives, that common language will help, having the common metrics for the accountability. It takes a little bit longer than we thought as building that kind of consensus, the political will. It's often not as probably most of you all involved in this, it's often not a technical process. It's very much a political process. As Mallorie highlighted, getting all levels across geographies, people understanding. So if you think about the RSPO theory of change talks about mobilizing, acting, and transforming. And so we've had this decade of mobilizing. So now we're here in 2020. Let's think forward about the acting. So if we move from this decade of commitments, and the UN talks about the decade of action. So as we move now into this decade of action, looking forward and applying that. I don't want to just kind of constantly go one by one. So I want to pop it around a little bit. So I'll go back to you, David, and thinking about from moving from commitment to action. Again, the work that you have done, collaborating with businesses, if maybe you could elaborate with, where do you see taking some of those lessons learned you talked about, the accountability framework you have, and applying that going forward?
Sure. So foremost, I would say, yes, 2030 will be important. We cannot wait until 2030. We know from the IPCC special 1.5 degree report, the recent IPBES report, that we're facing, twin crises of climate and biodiversity. So it's still 2020. We still have time to act, and that's what a lot of the NGOs are counting on from our peers in the private sector. I think some important lessons that we need to take in mind. So in Latin America, where my organization does a lot of work, we're seeing fewer large companies. There's a lot of SMEs that dominate the landscape. A lot of these companies don't necessarily have the technical capacities or resources to engage with what are costly methodologies, complicated methodologies, sometimes even how to get started on the stepwise journey to smallholder certification. So we need to invest in capacity building. I think, as Mallorie said, we do need to work collaboratively. That being said, our expectation of companies is that they're not putting all of their trust in NGOs and service providers to solve all of these problems for them. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to come to the grips with the fact that not everyone is going to come along on this journey, and I think we need to get some of those players potentially out of the market as we move to a new and better normal. We're still seeing some buyers that aren't clearly communicating their targets to their suppliers, and we expect that to change as well. On a technical note, I think one thing that we've seen a lot of is in the lead up to 2020 is a lack of transparency and data sharing. And that's really prevented us from moving forward with the types of large scale indicative mapping and monitoring initiatives that we've seen work elsewhere. I think that's absolutely critical in SME dominated landscapes where they don't have the resources to do this work themselves, especially given the lack of capacity. So I think that's somewhere we would like to see a lot of the North American players leaning in and helping to support those kinds of initiatives.
Great. No, that's a lot that we've got to do. And as Mallorie had already said, that some will not follow. And David's saying that as well. And I think recognizing that there's always going to be some that just are not going to. And how about you, Megan, for going forward thinking forward now for the 2030, you're carrying that ball there within Bunge. And so what are some of your messages that you have?
One is being innovative and creative within your own supply chain. And everybody's right that palm is a very complex and challenging supply chain. It's a challenging industry. And you're right, there's always going to be those issues. And so there's a couple of different approaches to that. One, there's times when you have to make those changes within your supply chain, and they cannot be a part of your supply chain. But at the same time, you want to have industry transformation and industry change because you don't want those bad actors to just continue to do what they're doing and go to sell to somebody else. So I think going forward, we're going to have to look at our own processes and our own procedures on how we procure palm, how we engage with suppliers. I think there was a comment about communicating. You have to communicate policies and requirements way down or upstream to all the way to the smallholders, refineries, and mills, and that's going to take time, and that's going to take a different approach, especially for somebody like Bunge, who sits in the middle of supply chain, or even the downstream food customers who are many layers removed from the smallholders and from the refineries. So that's going to take a change in process and a change in approach. So I think that's really just being innovative, and I'm always, you're going to hear a theme. I'm going to keep going back to collaboration through the supply chain is definitely key.
Fantastic. And Mallorie, from your perspective, working with a lot of different initiatives?
Yeah, so I'm hearing so many common themes, as you said. I couldn't agree more with David on the urgency that he expressed and the need for, companies to be held accountable. And I would say that I think we all have roles to play in the different stakeholder groups to catalyze private sector action, not that we can take it for them, but ultimately I think there's reasons for optimism, and there's 3 opportunities I want to highlight that speak to the optimism we can have in our ability to achieve 2030 targets, hopefully sooner than 2030. The first is, I think the challenge and problem of companies not having this consistent guidance has been solved with the accountability framework. So that is a great resource. I would also say that there is a constellation of organizations like NWF, and as you know, CDP has been mentioned, there's many other series that monitor and report and assess company performance in achieving their targets. And this community of actors has really made great progress in coordinating and harmonizing their efforts. So they're an important group and have an important function. The second, I would say, is the financial sector is really starting, I would say, to wake up to the risks that deforestation and associated greenhouse gas emissions pose to their investments. And we have seen that some finance that was going to bad actors, that it is starting to shift to have some sustainability requirements, and I think we need more of that. So the financial sector is really important here. And third, campaigning organizations have been very effective at pressuring leading companies to make and execute their ambitious commitments. And now I think as a community, it would be great to think more about how we can leverage campaigning efforts to address what we call laggard companies, as you know, Megan and David and others have mentioned, so that we can address that and get more people either in the tent with us or they're out. They have to understand they need to operate sustainably. So
and picking up on the themes I think I've been hearing, and having that transparency on that with the accountability of these metrics. So it's not just saying you're out and it's very subjective. You actually have these transparent types of frameworks that you all have been talking about, using a common language so you know what out means. But that's really interesting to hear about some of these opportunities, and I'm glad to really hear the optimism in that on the 2030. So we realize that it is sometimes challenging to think about the next 10 years, and as David said, there's an incredible urgency on that, because ultimately it really is about impacts. So we've got our mobilizing. We've gotten everybody collaborating, working on the common metrics, on the frameworks. We're getting to that common language. We've gotten, consensus and collaboration being built, trust being built, very critical. We're moving into this decade of action, and that's actually implementing many of these things that we've built upon. So on the impact side, though, part of the challenge is, I think, for many here, and this is a North American dialogue specifically, we're kind of a bit removed from, in the supply chain. It's happening in tropical forests that are often quite distant. And so that education that has been brought up by a few, the communication, education, How do we do that and talk about the impacts of what our purchasing decisions are doing and the supply decisions are making in terms of impact? I'll go ahead and start with you, David, on this one, if you don't mind. So really just thinking about the perspective, are we too far away, or how do we understand the impact, and how do we maybe communicate that? I realize that could be a whole conference, but your advice maybe on that one.
Sure. So I would really encourage companies to think about where they have influence and both how they can support smallholders, which have too often been kind of left out of these processes, and how they can support some of the burgeoning public-private partnerships that are starting to pop up. Like I said before, a lot of the companies that we work with in Peru and Colombia, they don't have the in-house capacity to address a lot of the technical dimensions of the, even the RSPO PNC, or for that matter, the new Colombian zero deforestation palm oil agreements. They're really reliant on outside consultants, and I think that we need to help build that technical expertise across the region. That could be coming from North America. That could be helping to place investment in train the trainer type initiatives, like the RSPO Smallholder Academy or HCS, HCV assessor trainings. Also making sure that those trainers are then equipped with the resources and ultimately the connections to put those skills to good use. I think it's really interesting to note that a lot of the companies that we work with in Colombia, they want to help satisfy the international, the North American market, but there also is a really earnest desire to help satisfy domestic and regional demand within Latin America, and they want to differentiate the region from the trajectory in Southeast Asia, which I think is really heartening to hear, and I love to see folks support that. So that being said, again, I would love to see companies getting involved in these kind of burgeoning PPPs, like the Colombian zero deforestation agreements. In Peru, there's the Coalition for Sustainable Production. In Ecuador, jurisdictional pilots. There's some newly launched initiatives in Honduras and Guatemala. All of these initiatives, they are compatible with RSPO certification. They're mutually enforcing. And I think this is a lot of where the conversations about implementation need to happen in a pre-competitive and, as everyone said, a collaborative manner to kind of move the needle.
Great. No, that's very helpful. I've noticed we've got a lot of good questions coming in, so I hope the panelists are ready for that. We want to make sure we allow enough time. So I think we'll go to one of those questions right now. It came in from, because we were just on this topic about new players continually, let's not say constantly popping up, new initiatives that are often duplicative or overlapping with existing initiatives, and how can we help encourage alignment towards best practice standards and metrics? I think maybe Mallorie, if you don't mind kind of taking that question on. I know you had talked about your 3 lessons learned included some of those aspects.
Sure, I'm happy to share a few quick thoughts. I think there's sort of 2 angles to address this problem. I think there are a lot of initiatives that pop up that seem duplicative, and I think in some ways innovation and competition can be good because some approaches work better than others. However, it can be confusing, especially for companies when they're getting different advice from so many different actors. So 2 things. I think initiatives may not always understand the value in actually speaking with the other, what they would consider their competitors. There's a lot of value in that, because what we've found in a lot of Meridian's efforts to do these sort of alignment and bring together similar but slightly different players into the room and see how they can work better together, what we've found is when they get into the room and start talking, they realize that they aren't competing. They have unique places and roles, and they have a lot to bring. And them as a group being able to articulate that to donors and to people who are skeptical, why are you doing this? We already have something like that. Having that narrative of how we work together and how we complement each other is really effective. And the second piece is I actually think donors have a role here too, to ask their grantees to, be in touch with each other and have these conversations so that they know how they all can work together.
Yeah, no, and I think that there is a unique those are great points, and I think it's a unique opportunity. Some of the frameworks you've already highlighted, David and Mallorie both, and I think Megan as well on the accountability framework. There's been a lot of time invested in these, so the newer initiatives can actually leapfrog. They can just kind of build upon and identify what's unique to their organization. I wanted to, Megan, we had a question for you about and I want to pick up because Mallorie was just mentioned about having innovation. There was a question if you would be able to, you mentioned that companies need to be innovative, and if you had any examples from your own experience that you could provide. We were talking just about, as we were talking about kind of going forward, the 2030, and you were talking about having the space to be able to innovate. So.
So I think a good example would be in how we approach our suppliers. And because we cannot, because of where we sit in the supply chain, we don't have direct access to many of the refineries or to the mills. And so that has caused us to have to think of very innovative, creative ways to still get our message all the way through many different layers of suppliers or handlers to get our message, a very important message, to the people that are refining and growing the fruit bunches. And so a couple of ways that we've done that, I'm sure many of you know the name Ben Vreeberg, who is on our team, and he actually leads Palm Sustainability for us globally. And he's had something actually very similar to what we're doing right now, but sitting in a room with, when we could travel, and sitting in a room with our direct suppliers. So, engaged one-on-one, sharing our commitments, and then having that feedback. But I think that really shows how important it is to us if we're taking the time to bring suppliers in to sit down and talk about us, and then expressing the concern, and then also relaying that they need to take that, our policy, their policies, which most of the time are very similar, and push that through the supply chain. Another way is looking at the way that we have vetted our suppliers, and we've had to change that. It's always changing, and I think we talk about new initiatives, but it's not just the initiatives for sustainability, but also the players that are in the palm market. And before anybody can come into our supply chain, we now have a lined out process and protocol. And so that has been something that was developed probably in the last five years. So moving with the changes and moving with the needs of the industry, because in sustainability, we're not going to get to a goal and just stop. It's a consistent and constant journey.
Yeah, it's a great point, that last one of that. Unfortunately, you don't get there and say, oh, we've reached it, now we can stop. It's a constantly moving, because it is a future oriented, and as well as what Mallorie was saying, it needs to become that kind of pre-competitive space. So you can sit down together and talk about it and find out where you have common ground and learn. Since we're talking about targets, though, I had a question I wanted to pose. So for a company that's looking at setting targets, should they kind of keep them low because then they can meet them, and they can, write up their report and talk about how they're meeting them? Because if they put up these big ambitious targets and they don't meet them, they end up looking bad and defending themselves. I'd like to hear some opinions on that. I mean, it's kind of like when you say, when you're doing your annual budget, like let's put our targets that we're kind of low so we know we meet them. So we on our performance evaluation, I'm not saying anybody here does that, but so you actually already know you're going to meet them. And really would like to hear kind of what do you think about that? So where do we need to go with targets? What would you advise to other companies that perhaps are only beginning this journey? Maybe start with you, Mallorie, on that one. You can think about it a second. I'm putting you on the spot.
Okay. Unmuting myself, but Look, I think they're given all the great progress with things like the accountability framework and all of the work that's been done on defining what are good targets. I think for the most part, civil society and governments and others are pretty aware of what are ambitious and not so ambitious targets. So, and I would dare to say that, you know, I think the community would rather that a company be more ambitious versus timid in setting their targets, meaning that it would be great to set a target that you know is going to require stretch, it's going to be uncomfortable, but you know it could be done with a lot of work and time. And then I think most importantly, that goal setting is one thing, but it has to be accompanied by transparent reporting so that stakeholders understand when progress is being made, and that transparency will build trust. So it's better to be honest as a company about some of your challenges, I would say, versus setting low bar goals that people aren't going to see as very meaningful.
That's good advice. How about you, David?
Yes, to everything that Mallorie just said. If you're a company and you don't have a commitment yet, I would encourage you to go to the AFI website. I believe it's accountabilityframework.org. You should be able to Google it. It's designed to help walk you through that process and show you what should go into a commitment. Frankly, I would be more scared of setting a lackluster target or no target at all, which would move you into that, you know, laggard territory, risk being excluded from the market, risk having, you know, I don't think they would have a problem invoking them, having Mighty Earth come after you, something like that. Now is not the time to be timid. You know, the twin crises I described before, we no longer have the luxury of time. It's time, you know, we have to go big now. You know, I'd really encourage folks to reflect on the legacies that they want their companies to leave. Folks in this webinar and North American market, you know, a lot of us we are the global leaders. We have the ability to shape what that new normal looks like. So I think we're at this point of, you know, there's a clarion call for that now. You can help usher in that era of sustainability that I brought up. So, you know, there are numerous NGOs out there based in North America that, yes, we're looking to keep you honest, but we want to partner with you. We want to see you succeed, right? That's what success looks like to us. As Mallorie said, if you are transparent, if you clearly communicate what you're doing when problems arise, I don't think that you have anything to be scared of.
All right. Yeah, as I heard from the co-chair of the board of RSPO, and you can't fail if you try, but you can fail to try. And you know, it kind of, as we're trying on shared responsibility, I kind of keep reminding ourselves, you really fail if you try. If you fail if you don't even try. So, Megan, how about you? You have to answer to probably bosses that say we don't want to look bad.
Yes, you know, all of us in the sustainability positions, we do this because we love it, right? And we also know that there is a much bigger purpose for all of the work that we do. And yes, when you sit within a publicly traded organization, we have to be the leaders. We have to have the loudest voice, and we have to push our organizations to create these goals that's going to push ourselves. And so much about the goal is about the journey and the steps that you're taking to get there. And so I am in agreement that you have to set big. I mean, I think we do that even for ourselves. So why wouldn't we do that for sustainability with something that has such a significant, you know, higher purpose in so much that we do? So yeah, definitely agree with everybody.
Great, great. So we have a question from the audience of, I think probably a smaller company, and I'm not sure who might want to take this on, so you guys think about it as I read it. What about smaller companies based in North America with limited budgets? How can they still play a role if they can't afford implementing certified sustainable sourcing? So they're an SME on the company side. So any experience with that anyone wants to chime in with? And I assume you all have some. So Mallorie, you're smiling, so I'm going to pick on you.
Honestly, I think David or Megan would be in a better position to answer that. Maybe David, I'm going to punt that one to you.
Sure.
You can
I mean,
always still go like this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. I think that it's a question, frankly, you have experts here from the RSPO. Cameron, who introduced the session, is the North American liaison. He's a great resource for these kinds of questions. You know, we have, I think a few years ago, we launched the North American Sustainable Palm Oil Network, NASPON, that it's also a resource to bring folks together in the industry to talk through these kinds of challenges. Beyond that, I would say, you know, start with your suppliers, start asking questions. That's the first step, right? You need to ask the questions to get more information, which you'll ultimately need to make decisions. So if you don't ask, you won't know. Other than that, there's, like I said, there's a lot of NGOs out there that you can write to. They all have general inquiries, right? And they will channel that to the appropriate people within their organizations.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as a supplier, I definitely talk with your direct supplier. You know, one of your questions, Aimee, was the influence in Southeast Asia. Are we too far away? And we're not. And so you never know what initiatives are out there, what your supplier may be doing. So I think that's a great place to start, and then in working, again, collaboration, but working together, I think that's a solution. That's absolutely the first step, and I can say that from experience.
Right, yeah, and there are, as David pointed out, a lot of resources there. A lot of them are, you can find, via some, you heard several of them mentioned, also the RSPO themselves and the resources there. And I think for SMEs, we can separate, I think for all of you, you can separate that concept of certified and sustainable sourcing. So it doesn't, certification is a assurance of sustainability, but being sustainable is ultimately what you want them to work towards. So there's a lot that they can already move towards that direction. So we still have a lot of questions coming in, but we are almost on our time. So what I wanted to do was just do a really quick rapid roundup. First, I have to really thank this amazing audience. I'd love to just, the amazing panelists. Would have been great to have sat down together and afterwards and go and have a meal or something, but we can't do that in our virtual world right now, but we'll have the opportunity. I'd like to just a real quick rapid of an action point you'd like for the participants in the webinar. Something, a word of, whether it's a tip or tidbit or word of advice you would like to leave with the participants. So I'll start with you, Megan. I'll go backwards then this time. So,
okay. An action point is, I would say, to think big and think globally. This is North American discussion, but we didn't get to the COVID question. But I think that it has exposed the global supply chain, the complexities, and also the inflexibilities of it. So now we have to think big and really challenge ourselves.
All right. How about you, Mallorie?
Yeah, thank you. And I think a lot of what Megan has said about, clean suppliers really resonates for me. So I would say my suggestion would be that if you are a company, traceability is key. You need to know where your products are coming from, and it's not easy. But whether that means getting to the farm level or tracing it to a jurisdiction that's providing assurance that they're achieving sustainability objectives at scale, those are two different modalities. But regardless, I think if you find that you're having a sustained problem with a business partner that you've had very well-intentioned negotiations and engagements and you just can't break through it, and your supplier is just not doing what they need to do, you have to be willing to drop that business relationship.
All right, hard facts there. David?
Yes and yes. I guess I believe with, between the global COVID pandemic, the recent social upheaval here in the United States, we collectively have a real window right now to rethink what business as usual should be, to reset our expectations, about what's possible and where we need to move. This obviously that statement is far bigger than palm oil and supply chains, but we know that the old ways of working don't work. Let's turn these supply chains into forces for good that will conserve forests and other natural ecosystems, that will uphold human dignity and lift folks out of poverty.
Fantastic. That's a good word to round us up. So Cameron, I'd like to bring it back, hand it back over to you. We're back over to you after a great, insightful conversation. And again, thank you for the panelists.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hoping that in the background, all the attendees are giving a round of applause. I'm sorry we can't do this for you in person. But yeah, thank you very much, Aimee, Mallorie, David, and Megan. I selfishly wish we could have this conversation for another hour, but we do have other panels still coming. But thank you all of you as well for joining this session. And just going back to the poll question beginning, just wanted to again summarize the results. We had 30% of everybody saying they met their targets, 53% saying they're on track to meet or exceed their target, and only 17 have not set targets. So for those, so for those who have set targets or are meeting them or exceeding them, I encourage you, as everybody had said, to share your lessons with everybody. Share lessons with some of your peer companies as well as some of your competitors, so that we can all help reach these targets for 2030 and beyond. So that concludes our session for today. Again, thank you, Megan, David, Aimee, and Mallorie. We do have another session coming up at 2 p.m., which is going to be about how North American stakeholders can make an impact in human rights. If you have not registered for that one yet, you can go to the RSPO website, rspo.org, and under events, you can find the place to register for all of the sessions coming up for today and for tomorrow and Thursday as well. So again, thank you to all of our panelists and Aimee for moderating. Thank you all of you for joining us for this dialogue session, and stay safe and look forward to seeing you for the other panels.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody.